Today I want to talk about this book, Undeclared Wars with Israel, which I published this past May. Undeclared Wars with Israel is a sequel to a book I published in 1997 called Divided Memory, The Nazi Past in the Two Germanys. Given that Ken Livingstone raised a ruckus here in London with some historical errors about Nazism and Zionism, let me begin by reminding us of what the Nazis thought about Zionism. And the evidence is overwhelming that the Nazi regime was not only anti-Semitic, but it was anti-Zionist. It despised the ideology of Zionism. It feared the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine because such a state would be part, from the perspective of the Nazi conspiracy theory, would be a Jewish Vatican. A Vatican for the Jews would be part of the international conspiracy directed against the Third Reich. And by all means, such a state should not be established, and the Nazis should give assistance to those Arabs who were fighting against the Zionist project, which they did. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union, most famously in the form of its foreign minister Andrei Gromyko at the United Nations, articulated what the Israeli Foreign Ministry once called Soviet Zionism. That is, as a result of the Holocaust, the Soviet Union would look favorably upon the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, and Gromyko at the United Nations supported the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947. Had the Soviet Union not done that, the United Nations would not have given the approval to the establishment of the state. This short period of Soviet Zionism is important to remember because in those immediate post-war years, liberals and leftists around the world, especially in Europe, in the United States, probably most prominently the Manchester Guardian here in Britain, viewed the establishment of Israel as a continuation of the anti-fascism of the Second World War. If you were an anti-fascist, an anti-Nazi, if you were opposed to racism and anti-Semitism, of course you supported the establishment of a Jewish state. And at the same time, in these early years right after the war, the Arab states, or rather some leaders in the Arab states, not all of them, but some, were famous for their support for Nazism. All of this changed with the breakout of the Cold War in 1948, and by 1949, the anti-cosmopolitan purges were in full bloom in the Soviet bloc. The government of East Germany was established in 1949, and for the entire existence of its history, the entire history of its existence, from 1949 to 1989, it was a state that was hostile to that was anti-Zionist. This shift from early Soviet Zionism to communist anti-Zionism persisted throughout the Cold War. There was what I call an 11th commandment of West German history after the war, articulated first by the conservative Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, but continued by left of center political leaders such as Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt. And it was a kind of unspoken 11th commandment. It was implicitly understood that for the West German government to break with Nazism, to indicate that there was a different Germany that was coming into being, not a different German people that was coming into being. The German leaders were perfectly aware of how many people had supported the Nazis, but if a German government that was different, then that different German government had to follow this commandment. And it was, I'll be quite blunt about it, it was don't kill any more Jews, and don't help anybody else who's trying to kill more Jews, and don't help anybody who's trying to destroy the state of Israel. You can have whatever opinions you wish about Israel's policy, you can be critical of this, that, the other thing, but if the world is going to try and destroy the state of Israel, don't participate. And throughout the history of the Federal Republic of Germany, the West German government, in terms of its government policy, pursued that rule. The East German government, as I said, was consistently anti-Zionist from the early 1950s. But the world didn't become fully aware of East German anti-Zionism until the Six-Day War of 1967, when Walter Ulbricht, the leader of the Socialist Unity Party and the government, gave a speech in Leipzig in which he, following the model of Yaakov Malik in the United Nations in New York, compared Israel's attack on the Arab air forces at the beginning of the Six-Day War to the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. This was an early example of what the Israeli historian Robert Wistrich referred to as Holocaust inversion, the description of Israel the description of Israel's treatment of the Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs as comparable to Nazi Germany's treatment of the Jews in Europe. And Holocaust inversion was an important theme of communist anti-Zionism and leftist anti-Zionism throughout the Cold War. The East Germany's policy and the Soviet bloc's policy towards Israel was also a matter of traditional foreign policy and power politics. The dilemma that East Germany faced was how to achieve diplomatic recognition from states outside the Soviet bloc, how to break the famous Hallstein Doctrine, and how to overcome the pressure from the Federal Republic of Germany against other states. The Federal Republic threatened states that opened diplomatic relations with East Germany, that it would cut off economic and diplomatic ties. The big recognition breakthrough took place in July of 1969, when East Germany used the anti-Zionist card and the anti-Israeli card to gain favor with the Arabs. By 1969, East Germany had a well-established reputation for propaganda assistance, diplomatic support, and a very small component of the Soviet bloc military assistance to the Arab states. So with the diplomatic recognition of Iraq, became the first non-communist state in the Middle East to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. Syria, Egypt, Sudan, Yemen followed very soon after. So this was the greatest diplomatic achievement and success of East Germany, and it had everything to do with the anti-Zionist card. East Germany presented itself as the friend of the Arabs, as the enemy of Israel, and that opened the door. The Six-Day War was important in West Berlin and in West Germany as well, whereas the turn against Israel in the Soviet bloc and in East Germany took place in the anti-cosmopolitan purges in 1949 to 1956. The turn against Israel in West Germany and Western Europe and in the global left really took place from June to fall of 1967. And in these brief comments, I don't want to go into great detail, but I will say that several historians use a phrase called conjuncture. The French used it, coined it, and that's to refer to events that don't have a necessary causal relationship, but happen at the same time, but then have a causal import. And what happened in June of '67 was the Six-Day War in the Middle East, the shooting of Benno Ohnesorg, a student at Free University in West Berlin, by a member of the West Berlin police force, and the support for Israel by the conservative publishing firm Springer Press. So the conjuncture of these three different events led the young West German left to conclude that the conservatives, their enemies in West Germany, were in favor of Israel. Therefore, the friend of my enemy is my enemy, and that what the radical left was saying about the fascist authoritarian nature of the West German government was true. Look at the shooting of Benno Ohnesorg. As many of you know, it turned out, it was revealed in 2009 that the policeman who shot Ohnesorg was affiliated with the Ministry of State Security, East Germany's Stasi. And if this had been known at the time, the history of West Germany could have been significantly different, because at that point the story would have been one about East German interference in West German domestic politics, not about the fascist nature of the West German police force and government. In 1970, a young West German leftist named Dieter Kunzelmann wrote a very important document called Shalom and Napalm to justify placing a bomb in the Jewish Community Center in West Berlin. And in Shalom and Napalm, Kunzelmann argued that he redefined the meaning of anti-fascism. And this is a major theme of the history of communism and the history of anti-Zionism. Kunzelman and then Ulrike Meinhof and others redefined anti-fascism as follows. To fight fascism in 1970, the West German left must fight against fascism, the most important source of fascism in the world, which was Israel. So whereas anti-fascism had previously meant the struggle against Nazism, now it meant the effort to destroy the Jewish state. And this was a profoundly important redefinition of the meaning of anti-fascism, because it placed a political tradition of enormous moral and political respectability around the world, anti-fascism, in the service of, ironically, in the service of attempting to destroy the state of the Jews. And that redefinition of anti-fascism began in the Soviet bloc, but it continued into the West German and West European global left after 1969 and 70. I have worked a lot in the East German files. The West German files are fascinating. West German government files are fascinating. Young historians should pay attention to the Interior Ministry files. There's very, very interesting and important material there. Don't have time to go into that now, but the East German files may be of particular interest because they're all open, and so we German historians have a field day because all the files of the Nazi regime are available and all the files of the East German government are available. There are very few dictatorships about which one can say that. The Defense Ministry files of the East German government are in Freiburg, and there one finds information about the military alliance between the East Germany and the Soviet bloc. On the one hand, the Soviet Union was overwhelmingly the most important factor, and the Arab states. And because the PLO was so good at publicity, because Arafat became an internationally prominent figure, we sometimes pay less attention to the state-to-state relations between the Soviet bloc states, including East Germany, and Iraq, Syria, Egypt, under Nasser in particular, Libya, than we do to the famous Palestinian terrorist organizations in the PLO. But what becomes clear in the files is that Syria was the linchpin of Soviet policy in the Middle East. The military ties, economic ties were very close, and there was a great deal of military training that went on in the Soviet bloc and in East Germany, and it's important to keep that in mind when one reflects on the tenacity with which Vladimir Putin and the Russians have held on to their, have supported their allies in Syria. The disaster of the last 6 years, is it 5 or 6 years, has a great deal to do with bonds of friendship and strategic common interests that were established in the Cold War. There are a lot of interesting stories to tell about that alliance. The East German military officials and diplomats who were in Beirut and Damascus were well aware that some of the people they were dealing with did not distinguish clearly between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I found no evidence that the East German government made efforts to restrain the use of terrorism or to criticize the expression of open anti-Semitism. The Politburo files of the East German government, as well as the Stasi files, are illuminating in regard to the history of the formal written agreements established between East Germany and the Palestine Liberation Organization. The East Germany was the first of the Soviet bloc states to open an office of the PLO in its capital city. It did so in 1973. Mao's China did in 1965. The Soviet Union did in 1974. And with the opening of the office in East Berlin, a dilemma emerged. There's a long, complicated story about this dilemma, but very simply, with the opening of the PLO office in East Berlin, the East German government faced a problem because many of the young people who were coming from Damascus and Beirut and the Palestinian areas wanted to continue the war against Israel in Western Europe and wanted to expand the war. and to punish the West Germans and punish the French for their support for Israel. And the way to punish them would be to carry out terrorist attacks in France and Germany, West Germany. The United States was aware of the problem and made clear to the Soviet Union that terrorist attacks that were carried out in Western Europe would probably fairly easily be traced back by the CIA, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Mossad, and other intelligence agencies to their origins, if they had origins in the Soviet bloc. And if this was the case, if it became evident that terrorism based in East Berlin or Budapest or Moscow was being perpetrated in Western Europe, that could put détente at risk. And with it, millions of dollars, millions of Deutschmarks flowing from the West to the Soviet bloc. The Stasi understood this, as did the Politburo, and the result was that the Stasi established a formal written agreement with the intelligence service of the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Abu Ayyad and Amin al-Hindi in 1979-1980, and the purpose of the cooperation was twofold. First, to include the PLO in something called Operation Friendship, Operation Freundschaft, which included military training and sending weapons to the PLO and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine in carrying out their attacks on Israel. Training, hospital care, money, that kind of thing, on the one hand. And on the other, to use the knowledge that the PLO had about terrorist organizations from the Middle East to assist the Stasi in preventing these people from carrying out terrorist attacks in West Berlin, West Germany, and Western Europe. In other words, what I call a Eurocentric definition, East Germany's Eurocentric definition of counterterrorism. And that was codified in a sense, in a series of very fascinating memos that are long-winded, and but I explain in the book. Just a few more comments. We can talk about the Entebbe hijacking at greater length. One point I would want to make that I think was very important for Yitzhak Rabin when he ordered the raid. It's not so much about, it wasn't so much that the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or two West German leftists from Frankfurt wound up in Entebbe and they were pointing guns at the Israelis. Or, of course, it was important that the Israelis and non-Israelis were separated in Entebbe. What was decisive was that this wasn't child's play. This was the government of Uganda. And that Idi Amin was in control of everything that went on at the airport. That the entire episode would have come to an end in a minute if Idi Amin had decided that it was going to come to an end. But Rabin and the Israeli leadership knew that in 1972, Idi Amin, after the Munich attack on the Olympics, had expressed his admiration for Adolf Hitler and his support for the Holocaust. He praised the Holocaust. And that when the plane landed and the evidence was overwhelming, Amin's soldiers were all over the airport. They greeted the terrorists. They were in control of. They could have brought the whole thing to an end right away. And the fact that the revolutionary cells in West Germany were collaborating with a man like Idi Amin is important to keep in mind when they want to talk about the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism issue. It's important to keep in mind that they were collaborating with an admirer of Hitler. So if you're just an anti-Zionist but you're not an anti-Semite, what are you doing collaborating with really a monster like him? A point about journalism, about communist journalism, that emerged in this period, which I think has had an enduring impact. It's a point about communist journalism. It's also a point about UN resolutions. The cycle of, it wasn't a cycle of violence. It's not a good phrase to use. There would be the PLO would launch a terrorist attack, say on the cities of northern Israel, Kiryat Shimona or Malot, others. The East German and Soviet bloc press would never report the accurate details of the attack. Sometimes they might suggest it was an attack on a military base. Sometimes they wouldn't say anything about it at all. when the Israeli Defense Forces would retaliate at the bases of the terrorist organizations, at that point, the Soviet bloc press would denounce Israeli aggression, Israel's unprovoked aggression. And so the rule of journalism was never report the initial attack, always report the retaliation, and then present the retaliation as if it was unprovoked, and thus one that reinforced the notion that Israel was an inherently aggressive actor. These rules of journalism amounted to a justification of terrorism in these years. One of the most refreshing aspects of reading the Stasi files is that when the leaders of the Stasi spoke with the leaders of the Palestinian armed organizations, they were remarkably frank about terrorism. They didn't use the public euphemisms about national liberation struggle or freedom fighters. When they spoke about terrorism, the word they used to describe terrorism with one another was terrorism. And the question was, do you or don't you support terrorism? And yes, as long as it's in support of the struggle of the national liberation movement of the Palestinian people, and as long as it doesn't harm the national security interests of East Germany. Two more points and I'll be done. The Soviet bloc was of enormous importance for the Arab states and the PLO, and this became apparent in the summer of 1989 and in 1990, because it was at that point that the military training programs, the weapons deliveries, and all that from the Soviet bloc ended. And when it ended, Arafat understood that he no longer had a military option in the near future to destroy Israel, and so he had to engage in some kind of longer-term political strategy in the Oslo process. The last point returns to a point I made at the outset about what I'm calling the anti-Zionist bridge. That the history that this book examines is about the anti-Zionist bridge. It made anti-Zionism morally and politically respectable in world politics in ways that ex-Nazis could not have done, because anti-Zionism was inseparably linked to the history of Nazism. And that was a very important contribution over these 40 years. At the other end of the bridge was Islamism. And whether we're talking about the Iranian regime in 1979, or Hamas in 1988, or later Al-Qaeda and ISIS, of course, for these Islamist organizations, there never was a distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They were proud of their hatred of the Jews and of Judaism and of the idea of a Jewish state, and for them there was no dancing around or ambiguity about this. But this book is about the history of the secular era of anti-Zionism, and the way in which the Soviet bloc and then the Western left made anti-Zionism a respectable feature of world politics. Last point I would make is the following. We have spent a lot of time debating whether or not this or that person or organization is an anti-Semite. And that's an interesting and important question. But as a historian, an equally important, and for me, sometimes more important question is whether or not what they said was true. And when you link a tradition that is of great moral authority, such as anti-fascism, to a set of falsehoods, then those falsehoods become respectable. And that was the contribution that the communists and the radical left made. They made falsehoods respectable. And in my country, as you all know, we have a government which is attempting to make falsehoods respectable, and which is disdaining the value of truth and fact and evidence. This disdain for truth and fact and evidence didn't begin with Donald Trump. It's been part of world politics for a long, long time, and historians, we need to fight against this disdain for fact and evidence. The United Nations made a huge contribution to eroding respect for fact and evidence for many, many decades. and we've seen the disastrous consequences of that disdain for fact and evidence. So I want to conclude speaking to my fellow historians to defend our values and defend our discipline, whether the attacks come from various parts of the spectrum.